Thank you so much for joining us. We are ready to learn 9 lessons from Parshat Chukat. Here we go. Very beginning of the Parsha, it says, Zot Chukat HaTorah. Now, we know that this is going to now talk about the laws of the Para Aduma, which is the classic example of a mitzvah in the Torah, which we don't understand the reasons for. But why does it say Zot Chukat HaTorah? It seems to be saying like this is the chok of the whole Torah. What is it saying over here? There's one basic idea which we can find in these words. Why Para Aduma is chosen as the example, that's a whole other question. But these words are telling us essentially that the Torah is a chok. Everything that we're being asked to do, we all think that we know the reasons, we understand why there's this mitzvah, that mitzvah, but in reality, it's all a chok. In reality, it's beyond our comprehension why we have to do the mitzvot that we are commanded to do. And in fact, if you think about it for a moment, this seems to add up just from our teachings. For example, Mesechet Yuma Chav Chet Amud Bet says, Kiyem Avraham Kol HaTorah Kula, that Avraham Avinu kept the entire Torah. Our Avot kept the entire Torah. But how are they keeping the Torah? They were eating matzah on Pesach time. They were sitting at a sukkah in Sukkot time. They blew a shofar, Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Those are all based on things that happened historically after the time of the Avot. So why were they keeping the Torah? How are they keeping the Torah beforehand? But if we understand that the mitzvot of the Torah are not because of the reasons that we attribute to them, but rather this is what is best for our neshama. On the 15th of Nisan, the best thing for our neshama is to eat matzah. On the 15th of Tishrei, the best thing for our neshama is to sit in a sukkah. And now we happen to have reasons, that things that happened historically that fit into it and that give us meaning to us. But ultimately, they are a chok. This is what the neshama needs in order to thrive in this world. And that is really the message of the Gemara in Sanhedrin Chaf Aleph Amud Bet, where the Gemara says, why doesn't every single mitzvah in the Torah have a reason given to it so we can understand why we're doing it? And then it says, it says, you know what? There were reasons that were given for mitzvot, and then people started saying, well, this is not appropriate for me. Shlomo HaMelech himself, the mitzvah of not having too many wives, the mitzvah of not having the horses, you go back to Mitzrayim, they'll lead you astray. And Shlomo HaMelech made a cheshbon and said, this doesn't apply to me. And that was a failure, because it's not a question of whether or not it applies to you or not. It's ultimately what is needed for your neshama. And that is ultimately the message of Zot Chukat Torah. We all fall prey to questioning what is the reason for this mitzvah or that mitzvah. Doesn't make sense, doesn't fit into the times that we live in. And it's natural to think that way. But that's because we are looking at the mitzvah with the tam ha-mitzvah, with the reason as the fundamental baseline for why we're doing it. But if we take a step back and say, and this is lesson number 1, it's all a chok. I have to believe in Torah from Sinai, and I don't understand why we're commanded to do everything. And then, as Rav Zevlev explains, the tam ha-mitzvah, the reason for the mitzvah, tam also means taste. We eat because we have to eat. We need the nutrition in order to be alive. We keep the mitzvah because that's what the soul needs. But then when we eat, we choose to have food with taste because it just makes it more enjoyable. So too we keep the mitzvot because we have to, because it was given in our Sinai, it's a chok. This is what our neshama needs. But once we're doing it, then we try to give a tam, we try to give a reason / a taste to make it more enjoyable and more meaningful when we are doing the mitzvah. Lesson number 1, every mitzvah is a chok. Hashem told us to do it, it's best for our neshama. Then we try to find reasons to make it more enjoyable and something which is inspirational and something which we can grow through. And that is the secondary part. The first part is Hashem said to do it, and that's why we do it. Lesson number 2. So we get into the actual para aduma. And it says in Yutet Bet, the yikchu elecha para aduma tmima, take the perfectly red cow, asher ein ba mum, it doesn't have a blemish, asher lo aleha ol, it's never worked before. Those last words, asher ein ba mum, the animal which has no blemish and has never had an ol, has never had a yoke on its body, never worked, Says the Chose Milublin, an amazing, amazing musar, not connected to the Para Aduma. And he says, if Nimtza Adam Yisrael, if there is any person, Hasover, who thinks, She'ein bo mum, I have no blemishes, I am perfect. Shehu Kalil Ashlemut, everything's wonderful. You know what he says? Mashma Shalo Allah all. Allah all. He never had a yoke of Malchut Shamayim. Ein Bamum equals Asher Lo Allah all. If you are a person who thinks that you have no blemishes whatsoever, you have nothing that you have to work on, that means you have not accepted the Ol Malchut Shamayim. You have not accepted the yoke of heaven upon yourself, because it's impossible. We all have flaws. We see every single day in davening, Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu. We recognize the fact that we have those flaws, and the greatest failure would come if you say, I don't have them, and dismiss them. It's just the opposite. You have to confront them head on. Rav Wolbe talks about this in Ale Shur, and he says, the worst thing a person can ever do, the greatest sakana, is to take anything that you have that's a flaw and push it aside and just keep on moving forward. As an Eved Hashem, you have to confront those flaws and work on them. If you're a person with Ol Malchut Shamayim, you will not be a person who says Ein Bamum. You will see on a daily basis the flaws that you have, and an integral part of your Avodat Hashem is going to be to work on those flaws. And that is lesson number 2, kind of out of nowhere from the Para Aduma, but a beautiful musar. Asher Ein Bamum, Ein Ala Ol. If you're a person who has the Ol Malchut Shamayim, you accept upon yourself the yoke of serving Hashem, you have mumin, you have blemishes, and that's okay. Spend your day, spend your time confronting them, working on them. That's how you grow as an Eved Hashem. That's how you grow as a human being. Lesson number 3. Zot HaTorah, Adam ki yamut ba'ohel. Yud Tet, Yud Dalet. This is the Torah when a person dies in a tent. And we have the halachot of what happens when there's a dead body in the tent in terms of tumat mate. We'll talk about that in a moment. Says the Gemara Masechet Brachot, we learn from these words of Zot HaTorah, Adam ki yamut ba'ohel, Ein divrei Torah mitkaimin el b'mi shememit atzmo aleh. Torah can only stick to a person. Torah can only be everlasting if you kill yourself for it. What does that mean, that you kill yourself for it? So there's a few different explanations what this can mean, but all of them come together for how we can make sure that Torah stays with us. First of all, you have the Mishnah in Perkei Avot, Perek Vav, Mishnah Dalid. Kachi darchat shel Torah. This is the way of the Torah. Pat b'melach tochel, you just eat bread with salt. Mayim b'shur tisha, you drink water. Al aretz tishan v'chayet tzar tichya, you live a life of pain, you sleep on the floor. That's the way of Torah. And then you learn Torah. The Maral explains, doesn't mean that's what you have to do in order to acquire Torah. It has to be what you're prepared to do in order to acquire Torah. If, for whatever reason, the circumstances are such that the only way you can learn Torah is if all you eat is bread with salt, is if you have to sleep on the floor, if you have to have tsar, then do it. That's what you have to be ready to do in order to acquire Torah. And that is lesson number 1, or part 1 of this lesson, in terms of killing yourself. The Torah learning that we do has to be so important that we'll literally put ourselves in tsar and give ourselves great difficulty in order to learn that Torah. If you don't have to do that, that's okay. But you were willing to do that, that captures, that describes it shows, it demonstrates your connection to Torah. And that's the only way that Torah will ever survive, is if you're willing to do so. Because in life, there are going to be highs and lows. There are going to be difficulties. But I'm willing to learn Torah in all circumstances. That's part 1. Part 2, Shulchan Aruch says, Kol ish Yisrael chayav b'talmud Torah. This is in Yoredei Rish Mem Vav Aleph. And he says, Bein ani, bein ashir, whether you're wealthy, whether you're poor, whether you're shalem begufo, whether you're healthy, whether you have a bal yisurim, no matter what age you are, afilu ani hamachzer al psachim, you're a poor person who's walking around collecting money, a person who has a wife, children, you're busy. Chayav l'kvol l'zman l'talmud Torah b'yom v'layla. You must have time, day and night, to learn Torah. This is also killing yourself for Torah. The fact that in any circumstance, no matter what I'm going through, I have to make sure that I'm learning Torah. Shulchan Aruch says further, in Orach Chaim Kufnin Al Hey Aleph, you have to have time for learning Torah. Shalo yavirenu af im husavar l'arviach arbe. Even if you're going to make a lot of money, If you didn't learn Torah, that's killing yourself. That's sacrificing, because this is the time that I'm supposed to learn Torah. And the Mishnah Berurah explains, have a time every single day. And if something happens in the time for your learning was taken away, make sure that it's like a chov, it's an obligation that you have, and make sure that you're learning Torah. So that's part number 2. And part number 3 is just to learn Torah requires hard work. And hard work is meimet atzmo. There are people in the world who, quote unquote, kill themselves for so many things. We have to do that for Torah. So 3 different levels. And lesson number 3, the general idea is we have to be willing to kill ourselves for Torah. That means to have the mindset that even if I'm going to be sleeping on the floor and eating just bread, I'm going to do that for learning Torah. Number 2, even if you are going through great difficulties, you have to make sure that you have the time for learning Torah. And if your set times are taken away for any reason, view it like a chov and make sure that you make it up. And also the perseverance, the focus you have to have in order to capture Torah. Everyone has the capacity to learn Kol Torah Kula, but it requires being memis atzmo aleh. You have to be dedicated to, quote unquote, kill yourself in order to accomplish it. Lesson number 3. Lesson number 4. We have halachot in the parsha that deal with tumah and kelim, the impurity that comes to vessels. And in Yud Tet Vav, it says, we're going through the specific halachot of different vessels. Says Rashi, it's talking about pottery. Pottery is only makabel tumah from inside of the kli, of the vessel. There's no tumah from outside. If someone touches the outside, or if there's tumah out there, it doesn't make a tumah. Only from inside the kli can there be impurity. Says the Kotzker Rebbe, an amazing idea. Again, taking a lesson from a halacha which seems to be just a technicality about the laws of purity and impurity. And he says, Tuma darka le'halchis b'macham chashivas. You know where impurity goes? The way Hashem made the world? Impurity goes to the most important places. Let's talk about that in terms of the vessel first. By a kli matechet, by a metal vessel, it's a more prestigious vessel, therefore it's worth something on its own. You can just touch the outside, the impurity can touch the outside of the kli matechet. That's the place where it's chashuv. It's a very important, prestigious, so to speak, vessel. The tumah is able to transfer there. But when it comes to a pottery vessel, it doesn't really have a value. It's a cheapened vessel. Why is it important at all? It's because it's something you can hold things in. You can put food in it, you can put something else in it. So it's the inside of the kli that's chashuv, and therefore mekabel tumah rak mitocho, mimakom chashivuto, and therefore the tumah is only on the inside, because there's no chashivut, there's no significance to the outside of the kli cheres, and therefore the tumah only transfers and only takes hold on the inside, where it does have some chashivut because it's holding something. It's a vessel which you can make use of. Think about this idea for a moment, not in terms of the vessels. Impurity attaches itself to the most important areas. We have an idea in general that impurity goes where there's kedusha. Specifically, the Bali Musar say, when you're learning Torah, that's when impurity can sneak in. When you're davening, that's when it can sneak in. It actually comes at your greatest spiritual heights. You're in a place in life where you're doing great in your avodat Hashem. That is specifically where the impurity can come in, because that's just the way Hashem made the world. We think of it as, oh, the impurity is if you're involved in impurity. And now we're saying it's just the opposite, that it comes and it can connect to you when you're involved in the greatest kedusha. That's where it kicks in. And that is lesson number 4, for us to be aware of the fact that specifically when we're involved in holy pursuits, that's where we have to be careful about the degree of the Yetzer Hara and the impurity coming in. And by the way, that impurity can just be improper thoughts of, I'm davening for the wrong, I'm learning for the wrong reasons, or I'm chazin in the greatest moments and I'm thinking about the wrong things at the time. I want to let everybody hear what a beautiful voice I have, how talented I am. It can be the wrong thoughts and the wrong intentions at that height of kedusha. But that's where we really have to be on guard. Even when we're involved in levels of kedusha, lesson number 4, get ready, because that's where the tum'ah actually can take hold. Moving on to lesson number 5, also related to Tumah. Bamidbar Yud Tet Tet Zayin, B'chol asher yigal pnei hasadeh b'chal cherev u'b'meit u'b'etzem u'b'kavi Tumah shivat yamim. The whole idea of Tumat Meit, such a strong impurity of someone who comes into contact with a dead body. And we've spoken about this before, but it's so important to think about it whenever we're exposed to this idea. When we're exposed to the idea of Tumat Meit, even on the most simple level, when we wash our hands after leaving a cemetery, which is not really to get rid of the Tum'ah, but to think about this idea. And by the way, the whole beginning of Parshat Chukat is the person getting rid of their Tumat Meit. To think about that Tumah always goes in where the Kedusha was. There was great Kedusha in the human body because you had a soul involved in Avodat Hashem. When it leaves, the highest level of Tumah fills that vacuum, fills that void. And that's why there's Tumat Meit, because now it's a body that's devoid of the neshama, and now the greatest Tumah comes in. That should lead us to think what great Kedusha there is in the human body, what great spiritual potential every single one of us has. I was thinking about the fact that we say in davening, Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam, kishem shemati shimoto b'shmei mamrom. We say Kedusha every single day. How do we introduce it? We say, we are now going to do exactly what the heavenly angels do. I'm a limited human being with all of my flaws, but yet I'm elevated. I have the capacity to do what the angels are doing. And we have to remind ourselves of the great Kedusha that we have inside. I think we sell ourselves short very often because we are so focused on the physical world. We're earning a living. There are things that we enjoy, entertainment, things along those lines. And we don't even see the capacity that we have spiritually. Think about Tumat Meit, and this is lesson number 5. Think about this idea that a person is tamei for 7 days. When they come into contact with the dead body, there's also the Tumat Ohel that we talked about before. That shows us, that's a reflection of the great Kedusha that we have when our neshama is inside of us, the great spiritual heights that every single one of us can reach. Moving on to lesson number 6. Now we go to one of the most difficult, tragic stories in the Torah, the sin of Moshe and Aaron. We're in Bamidbar Chaf, Pasuk Yud, and the people are complaining. They want to have water. Hashem says to speak to the rock. Moshe and Aaron get together. Vayikilu Moshe and Aaron at Kahal, El Pnei HaSelam. They bring them around the rock. Vayomer Lahem. He says to them, Shimu na hamorim. Listen, you rebellious people. Hamin hasela hazen otzila chamayim. Can we get water out of this rock? There's many different levels to this, but the first is from Rav Levi Yitzchak Barditchev. And he says, this was actually a great sin of Moshe. Why? He says, because the people were suffering terribly at that moment. They didn't have water, right? Miriam passed away. They lost the Be'er. They are suffering. And in that moment, says Rav Levi Yitzchak, Tzarich la'azor lehem, v'lo lahochicham. This is not the time to rebuke them. They were suffering, then you have to help them. There might be a time afterwards for constructive criticism and try to help them learn from whatever their mistake was. But right now, when you have someone suffering in front of you, you as a fellow human being, you as a fellow Jew, you as the leader, all you can do is help them. And that is lesson number 6. Because all of us are leaders in our lives. We have families, we have children, we have students, we have employees. When people, even if they failed, when people are down, they need help. And giving them tochacha, which is our natural response, it was Moshe's natural response, to just lace into them and give them rebuke. Rav Levi Yitzchak says that was a sin of Moshe Rabbeinu. Again, we're talking about the great Moshe Rabbeinu, but he also has failures. Because at that moment, all you have to do is help them. And that is what we have to think about. Lesson number 6, when we see our child, when we see a student, when we see a coworker, an employee in distress, and their distress is coming because of a mistake that they made, they are off, the first thing we have to do is help them. Help them. And then there will be a time afterwards to try to correct the flaw. But so often we just begin to yell and scream and lace into them. And how can you do this? They're human beings. And human beings have flaws. And human beings will make mistakes. And the challenge is to learn from them. And the first thing that we have to do, the Beit Adam L'Chavero at that moment, is to help them. Students, children, colleagues, employees, you see someone in distress, your number one mission is not to lace into them, is not to give it to them for their mistake, but rather to help them. And then afterwards, to try the way to help them learn from a mistake and become better. Lesson number 6. Lesson number 7, which is a little bit of a continuation of this point. Bamidbar Chaf Yud Bet, Hashem says to Moshe and to Aaron, Ya'an lo hemantem bi laktisheni le b'nei Yisrael. You didn't believe in me, you didn't trust in me to glorify my name in front of Bnei Yisrael. What does Rashi say? She'ilu dibartem el haselef. You would have spoken to the rock. V'hotzi meimav, and the water would have come out. Haiti mekudush leinei ha'eda. The people would have learned from that. They would have said, my goodness, the rock is listening to Hashem. We have to listen to Hashem. We have to get better. Bnei Yisrael could be on a higher level. A lot of the commentaries say that the reason why Moshe and Aaron could not enter Eretz Yisrael is because when they said, can we get water out of this rock? Of course they knew they could. But they were saying, we can't do it for you, Bnei Yisrael, on the low level of spirituality where you are. We can't do it for you because you have to be in a higher level in order to merit a miracle of this kind. They judged the Jewish people to be on a lower level that they were. And now Hashem says to them, yes, right in front of your eyes at that moment, they were on a low level. But had you listened to me, my entire purpose was to make this great miracle happen, and they would learn from it, and that would elevate them to a higher spiritual level. But if you don't see the high spiritual level they can be on, you cannot lead them into Eretz Yisrael, where they need to be in a high spiritual level. They need a leader who believes in them and who sees the great heights which they can reach. This also relates to the previous situation of our children, of our students, etc. We have to believe in them. We have to recognize that they have the potential to grow. Far too often we write people off and we stop seeing the spiritual potential that is latent inside of every single human being, no matter how low they have fallen. And all we do is slam them, and all we do is close the door on them. And that is the greatest tragedy. We have to learn that as well from the sin of Moshe and Aaron. Not to see the person who's in front of you right now, but to see the potential that they have. And every single human being has the potential to improve and to reach the greatest of spiritual heights. And that is lesson number 7. Moshe and Aaron, again, on their level, they were not able to see where Bnei Israel could reach. We have to learn from that and hear Hashem's message that there's something which can always motivate them. There's something which can always inspire them. We never close that door. We never look at them as where they are right now, and always interact with them based on the potential where they can go and actually play a role in trying to help them reach that potential. Lesson number 7. Lesson number 8. This parsha is filled with real sadness. We have Miriam passing away, and then Chavtet, Aaron, this dramatic scene on Hor Har, where the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is given over to his son Elazar, and Aaron passes away. Vayiru kol ha'eda ki gava Aaron. They saw that Aaron passed away. Vayivku et Aaron shloshim yom kol Beit Yisrael. Every single Jew cried for Aaron in those 30 days. Aaron, a Kohen, was this person who we know. We learned in Pirkei Avot, Aleph Yud Bet, that he was an Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom. He was a person who loved peace, who chased after peace. And because that was the way that he lived his life, he was able to be at peace with every single person in Am Yisrael, to the point that every single Jew cried for him. That's an amazing, amazing thing, especially for someone who is a leader. Leaders are the targets of people who are, whether they're jealous or maybe even have legitimate gripes against them. But the fact that despite, and it must have happened, people had issues with Aaron, but he found a way to smooth it out with everyone and leave whatever the situations were with shalom. And Hillel says, heavy mitalmidav shel Aaron. We should strive to be like the students of Aaron, ohev shalom, v'rodev shalom. This does not mean that there won't be conflict. Life means conflict. Interactions with other human beings, whether it's in families or it's at work, it's in communities, there's going to be conflict. But how do you resolve those conflicts? To leave it b'shalom. That is the greatness of Aaron HaKohen. And that's why Kol Beit Yisrael was ever able to mourn for him. You know, we say in Kaddish, we just say these words without thinking about them. But Oseh Shalom B'Ramav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu. We ask Hashem, please let us be in a situation where we have peace. To be in that situation where people who are involved in peaceful interactions, and that Kol Beit Yisrael, every single person, can cry and mourn over your passing away, like Aaron HaKohen. This is lesson number 8. We have to be people who strive for that shalom. And even when there are conflicts, even when there are disagreements, to try to work to get to a point where there's a resolution of shalom, of peace, so that everyone can move on in their lives without holding gripes, without the anger. And that is what Aaron HaKohen was able to do. That is what we have to strive for in our lives as well. Finally, lesson number 9. We have the story of the people. Again, they complain they again over and over again. And now we have the situation where the serpents and the snakes come in and people are suffering. And Moshe davens to Hashem, Chaf Aleph Chat, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Aseh lecha saraf, make this serpent, put it on the nace, put it on the pole. Anybody who gets bitten will see it and will live. And the well-known Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Gimel Chet, that snake determines who lives and who dies. That's crazy. What is this all about? Do we believe in superstition? Just looking at the snake heals you? When the Jewish people would look at the snake, it would make them look up. And they dedicate their hearts and their souls to Hashem, and then then they would get healed. Tshuva is not some kind of magic. It's not going like this. It's not even just fasting on Yom Kippur. It's a process of seeing Hashem and dedicating yourself, subjugating yourself to Hashem. That is how you can have that renewal. There's no voodoo, there's no magic, but it's the hard work of looking deep inside and connecting your neshama to Hashem. And that is what we have to take away lesson number 9 from this story. To recognize, we've been talking about if you have flaws, if you have failures, challenges, our children, our students, etc., the pathway towards getting better is that relationship with Hashem. That is exactly what we see over here. Mishabdim et libam la'aviyam shabashamayim. That is what enables a person to get back on the right track. Lesson number 9. Let's go over all the lessons that we learned from this week's parsha, starting from the beginning. Zot chukat haTorah. All the mitzvot that we do, they are all chukim. The reasons that we have are just to add taste, but the goal that we have to work on is doing them because Hashem told us to do so. Lesson number 2. Asher im bamum asher la'alol. If you're an Eved Hashem, you will see the blemishes, you will see your flaws, you will confront them. A person who says I'm perfect is not a person who's being real with himself and not real with relationship with Hashem. But confront the flaws, recognize that we have them on a daily basis, and try to fix them. Lesson number 3. We talked about memis atzmo zot adam Torah adam kimud ba'ohel, killing ourselves for learning Torah. Be willing to live even a life of tsar if necessary in order to learn Torah, but to do the hard work of learning Torah even in the most difficult of circumstances. Bikovei itim laTorah, have the time, and it's always there no matter what. And if you have to move it for some reason, you find another time for it, and push yourself to learn as much Torah as possible. Literally, like you're killing yourself over it, and then you can master Torah. Lesson number 4, we talked about the klicheres. It's important, it's only the inside, not the outside, and therefore that's where the tumah goes. The Kotzker Rebbe, that impurity will catch onto you, will latch onto you when you are involved in Kedusha. Be aware of it. Even when you're involved in holy pursuits, the tumah can come in. Lesson number 5, we talked about tumas mes. 7 days, one of the harshest tumas that could be. The para aduma is necessary. Recognize that that's because of the great Kedusha that we have inside of ourselves when we are alive. When we are alive, we have that great Kedusha. Recognize how great we can be spiritually. Do not sell ourselves short, and recognize that you can connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu the same way the Malachim make Kedusha, we Kedusha as well, and we connect ourselves to Hashem. Lesson number 6, Moshe and Aaron yelled at the Bnei Israel when they were in the moment of distress, and the Chozam and Rav Levi Radisha pointed out that was part of their sin. When someone is suffering in front of us, even because of a mistake they made, a child, a student, an employee, help them. That's what you should do first. The rebuke can come at a later time in a softer way, possibly. But when someone is distressed right now, no matter what the reason, our responsibility is to help them. Lesson number 6. Lesson number 7, building off of that, Moshe and Aaron didn't see the level Bnei Israel could reach. Yan lo hemante bila hakdisheni. Had they done this, this would have elevated them. And that was part of their sin as well. We have to believe in our children, believe in our students, believe in people around us, and believe that they can become better, and believe they can reach great heights. That's our responsibility, to see where they can go to based on what we said before of their ultimate holiness inside of them and not where they are right now. Don't see them as bad. Don't see them as negative. Don't see them as where they are now, but where they could be and where you could help them possibly get them to. Lesson number 8. We had Aaron pass us away, and all of Bnei Israel mourn for them because Aaron was the Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom. We in our lives have to constantly be seeking for that peace, even in situations of conflict. There's ways to resolve it. B'shalom. And final lesson number 9, the snake that was put on the pole, that was not because of some kind of magic, but rather the people would look at Shemayim, they'd be mishabed themselves to Hashem, and then they could get better. That is how tshuva works. It's not from any kind of magical things that we do, but it's from the hard work of digging inside and connecting our neshamot and our hearts to Hashem. And then through that reconciliation and that connection, we are able to accomplish the highest level of tshuva and recreate and refresh that relationship with Hashem. Let's take some of these lessons, incorporate them into our lives. Thank you so much for joining us. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.